Dumas. I'm chairperson for the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce and president of Jessica Dumas Coaching and Training. I'd like to acknowledge that this message is coming to you today from Treaty 1 territory, home of the Ojibwe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene nations, and homeland of the Red River Métis. Thank you very much for joining us today from the comfort of your own home or your social distance location. We're very pleased to host this discussion today with our very special guests. We have over 300 individuals that are registered for today's event, and that helps us recognize how appreciative our local community is of the Canadian Chamber, as well as our community's desire to share their experience with our national chamber. The Canadian Chamber has been a leader among leaders at the national level, voicing members' concerns and advocating the innovative approaches to our federal government on managing through crisis and coming out in the best position possible for recovery. As chair of a large urban chamber, I'd like to share our appreciation for the Canadian Chamber and the leadership of Honorable Perrin Beatty, as well as Trevin Stratton, who will also be joining us today. Under the Canadian Chamber, our national network has come together like never before. And like never before, the power of the network has been demonstrated as the force that it really is. Perrin and Trevin, on behalf of the Winnipeg Chamber and our event partner, the Manitoba Chambers of Commerce, please accept our deep appreciation and thank you for joining us today and for all that you have done and continue to do to support our business and our community and our country. History will show that this very well may be the Chamber's finest hour. Thank you to the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce for partnering with the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce on this event. We appreciate this partnership that has really been a shining light since in the chamber movement since this whole shift began. It's quite encouraging to see the three levels of the chamber movement, municipal, provincial, and national, working so closely together around our one and only goal, which is supporting our businesses. So thank you for each of you for joining us today, and I'm pleased to hand it over to Chuck Davidson, President and CEO of the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce, to introduce more formally our panelists today. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica, for those tremendous introductory remarks. I think it's very telling again about the relationship and the power of the chamber network that exists in Canada. That we've got the Winnipeg, the Manitoba, and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce all taking part in this very important call today. Again, thank you again to Perrin and for Trevin for taking part, and thank you to the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce for partnering with the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce. Just to kind of give our listeners and our viewers a sense as to how this is going to work. We're going to allow for some opening comments at the beginning. There is a Q&A portion of this as well, that we will have some questions and answers, because we know that as business members throughout the province, you have a variety of questions on issues that are being dealt with as we deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we'll get to those. So you simply need to just go to the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom call here, type in your questions, and we will get to those as quickly as possible. In addition, Loren, Remillard, the president and CEO of the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce, and myself have a list of questions that we will also fire away at Perrin and Trevin throughout this call as well. So we're going to go for about an hour. We've got about 130 people on the line, so which is terrific. We'll start with some opening comments, and I'll just do a quick introduction. I know there's a extremely lengthy bio, but I think most people know the president and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has been a true leader in the chamber network for more than a decade. Perrin Beatty, the Honorable Perrin Beatty, and Trevin Stratton, who is the Vice President of Policy as well as the Chief Economist, and was recently in Manitoba. In fact, one of our most recent speakers. He spoke to the membership of the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce in February about the economy. I think all the things that we talked about in the economy that you were looking forward to at that time, I think those are kind of out the window now, unfortunately, though, Trevin. I think some things have developed as a result of that. So we'll look for a bit of an update in your comments. But for some opening remarks, let Perrin Beatty, the Honorable Perrin Beatty, if we could pass the microphone to you.
Great. Chuck, thank you very much. And Loren, thank you very much for your hospitality today. Let me pick up, first of all, where Jessica started off. This is an opportunity for us at all levels, municipal, provincial, federal, to be working together on an issue of critical importance to all Canadians. And the strength of the Canadian Chamber comes from our network. It is the 450 chambers of commerce and boards of trade across the country that represent some 200,000 businesses of all sizes, every sector, every region of the country, that gives us our force. And in Manitoba, it is you folks who are our eyes and ears on the ground and who help to make sure that we're aware of what the needs are and can serve all of our members more effectively. This is for all of us online and for all Canadians an extremely trying time. None of us could have anticipated even 6 weeks ago where we would be today. Trevin will talk to you in a few minutes about the most major survey that's being done of business conditions since the outbreak of COVID-19 in Canada. And it will show something about the force of what we've been hit with by the tsunami. But it's abundantly clear that what we're seeing is completely reshaping the nature of Canadian business and the Canadian economy. It's probably appropriate to start with a word of congratulations to Manitoba. Your record in managing this pandemic has been really remarkable. And it really sets a benchmark for the rest of the country to look at. But just because you've been successful in terms of managing the health aspects, and have done an extraordinary job there, doesn't mean that Manitoba businesses aren't feeling a dramatic impact as a result of the measures that have had to be taken to be able to protect the public health. And one of the things we want to be able to address today is what can be done to assist and where do we go from here. From the Canadian Chamber's perspective, we look at it in essentially 3 areas. The first is that we're focused on the immediate impacts of the pandemic and how we manage that. What can we do working with governments at all levels and with other stakeholders to try to ensure that business can successfully weather the storm? The second is that we're giving attention now to what are the conditions under which we can begin to reopen. It's abundantly clear that we can't remain on and should not remain on lockdown indefinitely. Public health comes first, and it must do so. Public confidence is absolutely critical. People have to know that when we do reopen, that the health of our employees, of our customers, and of the general public is the paramount concern of everybody. But it is critical for us now to be planning to say, what are the conditions that we're looking for at the time that we believe that we can begin to decontrol? And what is it that businesses should be doing and other organizations to put measures in place to protect our employees and our customers and the general public? If we have those plans in place, and if there's clarity, then this will allow us to reopen more rapidly. And that's absolutely critical. And it means then that we need to work together to do that. Then the third area that we're looking at is what should the public policy agenda be afterward? How has the nature of this pandemic affected our global trading system? How has it affected the nature of our business organizations in Canada? What has it done to public finances? For example, today we heard from the parliamentary budget officer who said at the federal level that we may be looking this year at a federal deficit of up to $250 billion. This is in addition to the accumulated debt that we have run up over the course of a century and a half. This means that even as we start to come out of this and as we start to decontrol, we're going to come out with a very serious fiscal headache as well. And governments at all levels are going to have to be looking at how has their agenda changed. We won't be where we were at the beginning of the year. And it's going to be important for governments at all levels to focus on the must-haves as opposed to the nice-to-haves. We need to focus on how we restore growth to the Canadian economy. We need to focus on investment. We need to focus on entrepreneurship. And government has to position itself to facilitate, to innovate, to encourage, as opposed to simply regulating and holding business back or taxing. So we need a fresh public policy agenda. And it's important that the chamber movement and the business community be at the table as that agenda is being developed at all levels of government. So Chuck, let me stop there and turn it over to Trevin, and then I'd very much welcome hearing from those who are online and be delighted to answer any questions anyone may have.
Thank you, Perrin. And with that, we will turn it over to Trevin, who is the Chief Economist and the Vice President of Policy for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Trevin?
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. And first of all, I mean, thanks to you and thanks to Lauren for the invitation to speak. You know, Chuck, you really just helped put things in perspective for me. It feels like years ago when I was in Manitoba. I guess it was just February. Now that I think about it. You know, on that note, you mentioned that a lot of things have changed, and Perrin mentioned as well that yesterday we just released some of the most comprehensive data on what businesses are currently experiencing during the crisis. And so what I wanted to do is maybe take you through a few of the high level findings of that nationally, and also maybe dig down into Manitoba as well, particularly to give you a bit of the lay of the land. And so what we did in the survey that we had that came out yesterday, it's really a comprehensive view into how businesses are adapting, managing, or sometimes sadly failing as the COVID-19 shutdown continues. So we received insights from more than 13,000 businesses across the country to bring into focus the time pressure that businesses are facing to avoid closing their doors permanently. At the same time, the survey also shows how quickly some of the businesses are adapting to social distancing and preparing for the reopening of the economy. And this information that we've gathered is going to be critical for governments and also for business leaders as they develop their programs and plans going forward. I'm sure many of you probably might have seen it in the media yesterday, but really one of the big headline findings is that over half of all businesses in Canada have seen a decline of 20% or more in revenue from the same quarter last year, from Q1 in 2020 since Q1 in 2019. Half of businesses have seen a 20% decline in revenue. Even within that, about 1/3 of businesses are reporting a 40% decline in revenue during that same period. These numbers are obviously sobering, but not surprising considering what we're seeing anecdotally, or we have been over the past months, and now we have data to prove it. When we asked businesses how much of a cash buffer they had going into the crisis, about 40%, 42% said that they couldn't operate longer than 60 days without a source of revenue. About 51%, so half of businesses said they couldn't operate longer than 90 days without a source of revenue. We're about 1.5 months into this right now, which certainly demonstrates that the threshold for businesses running out of time is coming up in the coming weeks. Similarly, when we asked businesses about the demand for their products and services, over 80% of businesses said that they have experienced a medium or high drop in demand since the crisis. And about 2/3 of businesses said that it was a high drop in demand itself, which is certainly concerning when we're looking at the numbers too. We also asked businesses whether they can remain partially or fully open amid social distancing measures. How long could it be? About 17% said that they couldn't remain open amid any time of social distancing. And certainly we've seen a number of businesses close over the past few weeks. Another 22% said that they couldn't be open for longer than 3 months amid social distancing. And once again, we're halfway through that. And so, this next little while, but also the programs that are in place, if they can be improved, if we get the money out quick enough, this is going to be crucial for business survival going forward. And then, finally, we also saw a number of businesses laying off staff. About 40% have laid off staff. Another 40% have reduced staff to hours or shifts. And so this certainly speaks to some of the numbers or some of the unemployment numbers we saw coming out of March with over a million Canadians, being unemployed. I did mention that there are some select findings that demonstrate Canadian business resiliency as well. About 45% are using new methods to interact with customers. 45% are testing working from home. About 12% are testing out e-commerce. A number of businesses are altering products and services, about 35% of them. And another 20% of them are altering methods of production as well. And so if there is a silver lining in all of this, it is certainly that in the face of many challenges, businesses that can at least have proven to be agile, much more agile than many governments that we've seen during this period, and actually adapting to new conditions. If we look at Manitoba specifically, maybe the other silver lining, at least for this province, is that Manitoba, in terms of the economic impact, has performed amongst the best amongst provinces during the period. If we look at, we asked a number of questions about disruptions to business during the crisis, and Manitoba, in most of the indicators that we looked at, has some of the fewest amount of disruptions. If we look at decrease in demand for products or services, Manitoba has the lowest amount of decrease in demand. If we look at disruptions experienced by suppliers, Manitoba is the second lowest. Businesses that are unable to move or ship goods due to disrupted supply chains, Manitoba is the third lowest. Cancellation of services offered by business, Manitoba is also the lowest. It goes on and on for quite a bit. Also, a number of Manitoba businesses are proving very adept at altering products and services. They're amongst the highest for businesses reporting that they've altered services, amongst the highest reporting that they've added new ways to interact with customers, amongst the highest reporting that they're experimenting with e-commerce. And so, Manitoba businesses, the negative economic impact of this is broad-based across regions and across sectors, and it's not good for anyone. But at least the impact is the least, or at least amongst the least for your province right now. And the businesses that are experiencing it are proving to be very agile as well right now too. If we look at the amount of businesses that said that they had to lay off almost all of their workforce, 90% or 100% of their workforce, Manitoba businesses are reporting the lowest amount of businesses that have had to lay off a huge amount of their workforce as well. And so looking forward, obviously there are a number of issues that we're looking at as well. We're certainly not out of this yet. Perrin has made a point of stressing that this is just the leading edge of the numbers that we're seeing. The worst is probably, most economists are projecting in Q2, in the second quarter of this year. Bank of Canada is looking at something like a 15 to 30% decline in GDP over the next quarter. But most projections, and I'll mention this is entirely uncertain depending on what rules are put in place and depending on how individuals and businesses react, but are hopefully looking for not a rebound, but for things to get better in Q3 and beyond. And so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, Chuck, I'll just jump in with my first question then. I will say this, just thank you very much, Perrin and Trevin. With respect to the data, I know a few people have noted the data is of great interest. I would encourage all those participating in the call today to please go to the Canadian Business Resilience Network, cbrn.ca. The data is going to be there. The data is being released in the Winnipeg Chamber newsletter that went out today, and I know, Chuck, you're distributing that to your members as well. So some great findings in there. Please make sure you're consulting your chamber communications. My first question, though, is for Perrin. As noted, the Canadian Chamber has been the leading voice in Ottawa advocating for business and has helped encourage the federal government to make some of the critical changes to some of the programs that have been announced. Can you talk a little bit about that work and the conversations that you're having with federal officials, in particular the Prime Minister? How has your experience as a former cabinet minister in Ottawa shaped your approach to government relations during this unprecedented crisis?
Loren, the first thing certainly I learned from the time that I was in government is that it's important when you go with government to go with solutions as opposed to simply problems. And in this instance, so very often business finds itself at loggerheads with government, and we're trying to persuade them not to do something they were planning or to do something they weren't planning to do. In this instance, we're all in it together. We have a common enemy here. There's a disease that is ravaging our economy and the health of our population as well. And we all are on the same side. Similarly, business and labor are on the same side in this. We maintain good relationships with our counterparts in labor, and I count, for example, Hassan Youssef from the Canadian Labour Congress as a friend. We'll often diverge or disagree in terms of how we should be dealing with issues. But when we look at this, our goal is the same, and that is to protect the health of Canadians and of Canadian workers, and to ensure the health of our economy. And it makes sense for us to work together. What I've seen so far in this is that governments have been very open. There's been more outreach by the Prime Minister and by cabinet ministers to me personally in the last 6 weeks than there was in the previous 4 years. So there's a real desire on the part of government to consult, to communicate and to bring people in. And as a consequence, it's made it possible for us to have input at early stages as government has been designing programs. One of the things they're clearly looking at is what's happening on the ground. And the uniqueness of the chamber network, the 450 chambers and boards of trade across the country representing 200,000 businesses, is that it's truly Main Street Canada. And I hear from you folks and from your colleagues in Manitoba and across the country immediately when there are impacts of changes in the economy or changes in government programs. And in this instance, then, it means that the chamber is uniquely qualified to be able to act as the voice of business to governments at all levels and working together. The other thing that we've done is it's exactly the same in Winnipeg or in Manitoba as it is at the federal level. Part of the uniqueness of the Chamber of Commerce is the power to convene, to bring together a lot of voices, often very disparate voices, around one table and to look for solutions. So one of the first things that we did was to say, in addition to our own network, how do we reach out to others? Labor is an example, but also other business organizations. So we created the Canadian Business Resilience Network, which has the 450 chambers and boards of trade of our chamber network, but also 100 other business associations working with us, all for a common cause of sharing information, ensuring that we're able to get information from government to put out to our members, but also that government is able to hear the voices of business. And the other thing I'll say, Loren, as a former cabinet minister, is that one of the toughest things is that there are so many disparate voices there, including for business. And when you get 45 different groups all coming to you arguing for something different, it makes it very difficult. You're called upon to cut every Gordian knot and to mediate between competing groups. The strength of chambers of commerce is their breadth. It's that they bring together people from a wide range of backgrounds and sectors, and that they give one piece of advice. And it's that integrating function of bringing people around the table and saying, these are the half dozen key issues that need to be addressed. These are what the priorities have to be. That then serves as a tool in a very positive way for government, because it helps to make the job of decision making and of governing much easier. So that's how it's functioned.
Perrin, great introduction. And I think part of, sort of the role that we find as chambers, and I'm sure you guys are finding, and I know we do at Manitoba and Winnipeg, is that as a number of these different programs, whether it be provincially or federally, are being rolled out, and the number of times that they're changing as well, what we find is that what businesses are really looking for is information and clarity on these programs. And I'm curious in terms of, is that one of the main reasons why the Canadian Chamber took the leadership role to establish something like the Canada Business Resilience Network, was to be sort of that conduit for information in terms of what the business community is looking for, and what kind of things and how more can business help out in regards to this would be the question I would ask you, Perrin.
Chuck was absolutely critical. First of all, government's suffering from a bandwidth problem right now. There's so many decisions, and the landscape is changing so rapidly that it's very hard for governments at any level to keep up with the decisions they have to make. And there are so many stakeholders who are involved here that their capacity to be able to reach out to each one individually is limited. It means then that by bringing people around the table, we are able to assist government in terms of getting factual information to businesses and others, but also in terms of soliciting information about what the impacts are. Did the wage subsidy program cover what was needed? What about other elements in terms of assistance to workers and so on? So that is absolutely critical. Information is the key currency here at this point. We need to know what's working and what isn't. We need to know what sort of changes can be made to be able to make improvements on programs. Governments genuinely are looking. They're not seeking ways to exclude businesses or to shut them out, but there are businesses still falling through cracks. And the other thing that Trevin would underscore as well is that largely the architecture of the programs is largely there. We know what the wage subsidy program is. We know generally what the rent subsidy program is, and so on. There will still be more programs tailored to specific sectors, and we'll see that. And they will be doing some fine tuning. And there are still companies falling into cracks that aren't covered today, and they'll be making changes there. But the most important thing at this point is execution. Trevin was mentioning earlier the issue of the solvency of so many businesses across the country. We are going to be coming out of this having lost tens of thousands of businesses, tragically. And it means then that workers won't have businesses to go back to. Their employer is gone. It means that governments will lose the tax revenue that would have come from those businesses. And what we saw even before doing the survey was that particularly small and medium-sized businesses, which are 98% of the businesses in Canada, simply don't have the resources, the cash in the bank that they can continue to run without money coming in. And that's why our focus has been very much on what could we do to encourage the government to get money into the hands of the people who need it as rapidly as possible, because money that comes too late is worth nothing. If the company is closed, then the subsidy is meaningless. And the message we've been consistently giving is that the urgency here, time is of the essence, and that what we're looking at is something of a scale and a force and a size that dwarfs anything we've ever seen before.
Thank you very much, Perrin. My question's for Trevin. Of course, in your role as chief economist, you're constantly monitoring key economic indicators and forecasts from various financial institutions and agencies. And I know you've touched on it in your opening remarks, but I'm hoping if you can kind of give us a high-level view of where Canada's economy was pre-COVID. You've touched on, obviously, what the impact has been right now, but maybe even a little bit based on what you've heard from that survey, what are your thoughts on where we're going to go? Where is the Canadian economy? $250 billion potential deficit. I'm asking you to look into your crystal ball a little bit and tell us what the economic landscape looks like.
Yeah, so I'll start with the pre-crisis period, and I mean it's all relative because there's a huge hit that's happening right now, but it's not, the economy wasn't gangbusters before the crisis either, and we should keep, we basically limped into the crisis itself. Last year, our economic growth wasn't, it was around 1.5, 1.6% GDP growth in 2019, but it really tapered off in the fourth quarter of last year as well. And then in January, we saw 0.1% GDP growth. In February, the numbers just came out this morning. There was no economic growth in February. A lot of that is due to, it seems like a while ago now, but the rail blockades that took place in February had a pretty big economic hit even before that, going into the crisis as well. Usually Statistics Canada, for instance, takes quite a bit of time before coming up with the GDP data. And so the official GDP numbers for March and Q1 are not going to be available till the end of May. But they did a flash survey for March this year. And so, based on that flash survey, the economy declined 9% in March. Obviously, it was quite large. This was the largest monthly GDP decrease on record, at least since they started using that methodology in the 1960s. There are a million people unemployed, also the largest decline in the labor force since they started tracking it with the same methodologies in the 1970s. This is obviously a historic crisis. I did mention over the next quarter what the Bank of Canada is looking at. So about a 15 to 30% decline in GDP over Q2. And sorry, that's a decline from Q4 last year. So 15 to 30% decline since then. Looking forward for the rest of the year, I always make the caveat that this is very uncertain economic projections during this time period. It's a very fluid situation, and a lot of it is going to depend on the decisions of policymakers and how Canadians react to it. But the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, did a projection for Canada for the year, and we're looking at around a 6.2% decline in GDP this year, over last year. Which is quite significant, obviously. But then hopefully we're looking at a rebound in 2021, as most countries are. At least according to the current projections, are around a 4% bump. Not making up the entire decline, or not even close to it, really. But at least looking at growth, hopefully into 2021. The good news is, somewhat good news, is that the second quarter is supposed to be very bad, the worst. Third quarter, fourth quarter, the decline is supposed to be less. And so that, hopefully we're able to enter a period of recovery at that point.
Trevin, maybe as a bit of a follow-up, I'm curious, when you saw the survey results, and in terms of kind of looking forward, are there some key sectors that we really need to focus on as we come out of recovery? And again, even to the point, are there some other key sectors, and I'm thinking specifically when it comes to tourism, that are going to take a lot longer to recover than others? And what kind of supports might those industries need to be able to get them back to, I guess, sort of a new sense of normal?
Yeah, and I can tell you from that survey, the hardest hit sectors were, StatsCan doesn't have a separate section for tourism, but if we look at things like accommodation, that's one of the sectors that's taking the biggest hit. Hotels. If we look at restaurants, that's one of the sectors that's taking the biggest hit. If we look at retail, that's one of the sectors that's taking the biggest hit as well. And if we look at oil and gas, energy, natural resources writ large, but specifically oil and gas, because of the drop in demand and what's happening with oil prices, that's another very big one. And you'll keep in mind, with the exceptional oil and gas, most when it comes to retail, when it comes to accommodation, when it comes to restaurants, a lot of these are small businesses too. Right, they're almost first on the chopping block when it comes to the hit that's happening right now. And so what's interesting, and I know that the Premier of Manitoba certainly mentioned about restaurants being reopened. I think it's on Monday, right? And bars. And so what we're seeing in a lot of those small businesses in those particular sectors is a drop in demand. It's people are at home and they're not going to restaurants, nor can they necessarily, except for through deliveries and things like that. And hopefully that drop in demand, that huge drop in demand that we've seen, that we're able to recover from that more quickly once economies start to reopen, because hopefully that demand will come back organically, at least if people feel safe in public places and feel safe, going back to businesses and things like that. Over the medium or longer term, there are those industries that have been hit by declines by disruptions to the supply chain. Things like manufacturing, like agriculture has had a huge hit to supply chains, not a huge hit to demand, but to supply chains. And so if we have a number of different provinces with different paces of opening up and different rules, then that might disrupt supply chains for particular industries over the medium term or longer term. And so, to have at least aligned guidelines when it comes to that will certainly help with recovery.
Chuck, I wonder whether I might just add to that.
Absolutely, Perrin.
Usually, when you look at recessions, at global recessions, usually the country that's first in is the country that's first out. When you look at it with how this is hit in terms of industries, it is not the industry that is first in that will be the industry first out. Trevin was mentioning, for example, hospitality, tourism, hotels, restaurants, and so on. They were among the very first hit, and they're going to be feeling it for a longer period of time than other sectors are as well. They're not going to bounce back. And if you look particularly at the restaurant sector, for example, if we still have social distancing measures in place, which one expects there's going to be in most jurisdictions, and you take, at the best of times, restaurants are a low margin business, and a large percentage of them go out of business within the first 3 years of being opened. You take half the seats out of a restaurant, and it's very hard then to see what the business plan is that enables the restaurateur to manage. So there are going to be sectors that even after the government restarts the economy, that are going to require specialized attention. And that's going to be absolutely critical. The other point I think that I would make is that we use terminology like I just did about restarting the economy or reopening the economy. And the implication is that it's like a car that we're going to decide we're going to get out our key, put it in the ignition, turn it, and the engine will start.
Right.
Not going to happen that way. We've damaged the engine badly. We've lost several cylinders in the engine. And it means then that we will be starting on a staggered basis to begin with, bit by bit, region by region, sector by sector. And beyond that there's been structural damage that's been done. It may be more appropriate for us to talk about rebuilding the economy than restarting the economy, and having a very focused view of that. And we certainly need to look at what sectors in particular are going to need continuing assistance.
You know, Perrin, you mentioned an automobile, and I think that's a good analogy for leading into my next question is really about North American supply chain, North American trading. Of course, Canada, United States have just completed the new NAFTA or CUMSA or whatever acronym you choose to use. How do you see trading relationships, supply chains, and the integrated North American economy evolving in a post-COVID world? Are we looking at significant repatriation of overseas manufacturing and a transformation of global trade into global trading blocks? Is Canada, sorry, I know these are a lot of questions, but is Canada at risk of a doubling down on the Buy America?
The answer is, as long as Mr. Trump is there, we're at risk of doubling down on Buy America, with or without COVID-19. But there are a number of lessons that we've learned about this. The first is that supply chains are working remarkably well under the circumstances. The whole of the global economy has taken an incredible hit, and this is, it's disease that is doing this. It's not simply political considerations. But in talking to grocery store chains and to restaurants and so on, they're telling me that for the most part that the supply chains are working well and they're able to get the products that they need. They are worried, as Trevin was mentioning, agriculture is under pressure. People are worried today about what happens with this season's crops in Canada. Are farmers going to be able to get them into the fields, and will they be able to get them off and get them into the food chain successfully, into the supply chain? There are a lot of lessons that we've learned from this. The first is that because we've become so globalized in our supply chains, and we've gone to the lowest cost supplier, and because supply chains have historically worked so well that they were like the electricity in our walls, that you assume you throw the switch, it's going to flow, no problem. Suddenly, when we found the shutdown of the Chinese economy, people who were looking for inputs from China, or people looking to sell to China, suddenly found that economy had been put into an induced coma. And this was a very serious problem. Where people had gone with one cheapest supplier, and that was Chinese, suddenly we were seeing significant shortages of goods that couldn't feed into these supply chains. Secondly, what we've seen is the growth of pandemic protectionism. And particularly as we're looking at medical equipment and supplies, over 75 countries have brought in export restrictions on medical equipment and supplies. And they've said, we won't allow you to ship this equipment out of our country. An example is, of course, the United States, where President Trump used Korean War legislation to say that N95 respirators couldn't be shipped to Canada. We were able ultimately to resolve that, but if even your closest trading partner, your closest ally, your neighbor, is prepared to say, "Forget it, Canada, you're on your own," it indicates the vulnerability that we have. Now, so the irony here, Loren, is twofold. The first is the lesson we should be learning from a global pandemic is that global problems require global solutions. You can't stop the pandemic simply at Canada's borders if there isn't a solution found outside of our borders. And it requires global collaboration. And yet through this, it's encouraged countries to be more nationalist and more local, and to put up borders and restrictions that weren't there before. You see President Trump, for example, pulling back funding from the World Health Organization at a time when we need to look for global solutions. So we will see an attack, I believe, on globalization. It will also require that countries like Canada will still, well, we should still be resolutely internationalist. We need also to look at what our needs are. If we can't count on other countries to supply us when we most need those supplies, then we have to ask ourselves, how do we protect ourselves? There are 2 or 3 ways of doing it. The first is you can stockpile in Canada and pay to build inventories that you hope you're never going to have to use, but you've got as a buffer. The second is that instead of having too many eggs in one national basket, that you go to a number of different suppliers in different countries, so that if one shuts down, you may be able to go to another. That again adds cost to you, to not simply be going to the lowest bidder. The third is that you nearshore or bring your production right to Canada. And we have built in Canada a Canadian public health industrial base now, similar to the defense industrial base that we have. My guess is Canada Goose probably isn't going to want to be in the medical mask business permanently. They'll want to go back to jackets and the like. Although, if they put the logo on it, this could be a fashion accessory that people around the world would be looking for. But we have built very quickly this base in Canada. We need to look at what do we need to maintain here, and how do we do that to ensure that in times of crisis, whether it's another pandemic, which is much more virulent than this one, whether it's a climate change emergency, a natural disaster, cyber terrorism, economic collapse, what is it that we need to have near home to ensure that we protect the security of Canadians? So all of that is in question. I would hope that as it looks at North America, with us now having the CUSMA, the successor to NAFTA, that the approach of all 3 countries would be, let's keep our borders open, let's look at how we work together. But what we've learned in this crisis is that even with these agreements, we can't count on our closest neighbor to be there when we need them.
Thank you, Chuck. I don't know if you're going to jump to the Q&A part now. Maybe.
Yeah, I was going to jump. We've got some Q&As, and if people want to ask some questions, I think they can do that as well. So maybe this question's for Perrin as well. And again, it comes from Tim Schmidt, and I know Tim's with the Steinbach Chamber of Commerce, and he asked the question about people really basing their decision making on the actions of the information coming from government, and asked the question: is government being asked to make sure their messaging is being considered as an important part of restarting the economy? And I think that really goes to rebuilding consumer confidence. And we're seeing that, right here in Manitoba, obviously, in terms of, the announcement yesterday by the Premier that things are going to reopen as of Monday. But there's still a lot of, apprehension, obviously, within the business community, with some businesses not potentially being prepared to open by Monday, and even more so with consumers. Because I think you've mentioned this as well, is it's one thing to open, but you also need to get that, that confidence, not only with employees, but with consumers going forward. So does government have a real role to play in that? Or is that, or does that need to be something more in concert with the business community? Because that's something that obviously Lorne and I are very strong advocates for here in Manitoba, and you at the Canadian level, but really in terms of rebuilding consumer confidence, because this isn't something we've really had to take to this level before.
Confidence is the key consideration. Government has to lead on that. And Chuck, in this instance, normally when we talk about confidence, we talk about confidence in the economy, confidence of investors, and so on. In this instance, the most important element of confidence is safety. Before anyone is going to come out of their home and go into a store, they're going to want to know that they're not putting their lives and the lives of their families in jeopardy. Same applies for our employees. As we reopen our businesses, our employees are going to want to know that they're going to be safe in coming back onto the work site. And so government has a key role to play there, working with business. At the end of the day, government is the arbiter of this. It's government and the public health authorities that decide when it's safe to open up. They need to look at it in conjunction with business, So first of all, that business can advise as to what is doable and what isn't. For example, one of the problems we have today when I talk to national retailers is they say that it comes right down to the level of local medical officer of health. And they may set different standards for who can come into a store in one municipality from what you get in another one or in another province. And they say, when we plan, we want to have supplies for all of our stores across the country, and we want to have standard protocols that we're using for what it is the stores have to do to protect the safety of their customers, their employees. So we need coherence in what we're doing. We need to work together on that. The other point I would make that I had meant to make earlier, Chuck, is I'm very concerned because with SMEs precisely on this level of confidence. What we are looking at, I've been doing some reading, looking at what's happened in China as they've reopened, what's happening in Germany as well as they're doing it. We are not finding in those countries the return to retail that there was before. People are staying back, and they're staying back, according to the pieces I've been reading, for two reasons. The first is, has the disease been fully contained? Am I at risk if I go into a store? My consumer patterns have changed when I'm going to the grocery store once a week instead of regularly going out. And the second is obviously financial insecurity still. People are worried about, where will I be at this time next year? Can I afford to make that purchase, or do I stay back? So building confidence is going to be absolutely critical. It requires both business and governments to work together.
Thank you, Perrin. My question, I'm going to merge a few things here. First part is to Trevin and then to Perrin. But Trevin, you have your doctorate. You've taught at some of the most prestigious schools worldwide. You've taught, lived, and breathed economics. Will this pandemic and its impact on our economy change our modern understanding of economic theory and how we view government's role in the economy? Is Keynesian economics dead? And you know, as it relates to recovery, and then again,
I'm glad you're putting this to Trevin as opposed to me with my past social sciences BA, Loren.
And the extension to you, Perrin, would be, you know, Manitoba has the largest Indigenous population in the country on a per capita basis. Be interested in your thoughts as to the conversations you're having with the federal government that where is reconciliation within the recovery plan. But first part to Trevin there.
Yeah, I just, so a few things I would mention. This is not an economic crisis or downturn like any other. This is not 2008 and it's not 1929. It's not the usual boom bust cycle, that we often see when it comes to economic downturns, right? There wasn't a building up of asset bubbles that suddenly burst. This is an external catalyst through a health pandemic, you know, that Governor Polaz has likened to a natural disaster, or Perrin mentioned, you know, a cybersecurity threat that created the catalyst for a downturn. So it's different in that way. Whether it will change our complete understanding of economics, I'm certainly a student of economic history as well, and so I look at how these crises tend to change these things. You know, I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is very much Keynesian. It's engaging in countercyclical spending. You know, this $250 billion deficit. Is that the question will be what happens after the emergency measures? You know, do they themselves taper off and we transition to pro-growth policies that are good for our economy and good for recovery and good for getting businesses back on track? Or is there going to be larger government intervention that's more of a longer term trend in the economy? Certainly within Ottawa policy circles and in the media these days too, you know, we've heard some of these proposals, whether they are for New Deals or Green New Deals or, you know, policies that are a bit more protectionist or a bit more nationalist to protect certain industries. That doesn't necessarily change our understanding of economics. It might take us back a few decades to where Canada used to be, but before we instituted some policies, that might have created some challenges for economic growth and competitiveness for many of our businesses. But the fundamentals, at least in terms of understanding what's going on, still apply. One of the interesting issues I think we're seeing is not that we're transitioning. I hate the false dichotomy of an old economy and a new economy. But when we're seeing this move towards e-commerce and things like that, are there new technological digital innovation aspects of businesses that many have adapted to and adopted during the crisis that are here to stay for the longer term, also as consumers get more used to consuming in that way as well? And so that's an interesting question. We saw this in the Great Depression, for instance, a shift from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. And is this something similar that we're looking at too? That's an interesting question.
I know we've only got a couple minutes left, so maybe I'll ask one final question before Lorne wraps it up, and I'll ask the question of Perrin. Perrin, I think, and Trevin talked a little bit about this, about the old economy and the new economy, and I would suggest that, and the impact this has had on the chamber network. On the COVID-19, at the traditional chamber network and what's emerging as a chamber network. So I'd be interested in your and we've seen it here in Manitoba, the amount of engagement that I can tell you that we're having throughout the chamber network as a result of this has been unbelievable. And I'm curious as to what you see as the future for the chamber network in Canada as a result of what we've had to go through with COVID-19.
I'll be glad to respond to that, Chuck. But let me also respond to Loren's question earlier about Indigenous reconciliation. No backtracking on that. It is absolutely critical to us. It's part of the key to resolving some of the issues that we have in Canada. Is absolutely critical to our competitiveness as a nation. And we'll be arguing for a change in the government's agenda in a number of areas, but not as it relates to Indigenous reconciliation. We must succeed in that in Canada. And one of the things we've learned from this, and it applies to your question as well, Chuck, is we're stronger together when we work together, when we're one country. And what the Chamber Network has seen as the strength that comes that when all of us are working together. Chambers of commerce across the country are hurting because their members are hurting. And if Main Street has gone dark, that means that people don't have the capacity to support their chamber that they had previously. And that means that it's critical for us to work together. So the Canadian Chamber is absolutely determined in anything that we do to ensure that we use our voice and our resources to try to assist. That was one of the reasons why we argued that nonprofits should be eligible for the wage subsidy. And it's why we wanted to put resources available through the CBRN to support all of the network, and to do so free. And we're going to continue to do that. The other thing, though, is we're changing the way in which we're doing business as well. What we're doing right now is an example of that. And in many ways, we're not going to go back at the Canadian Chamber. We have done more outreach in terms of using digital technologies to go into communities that you just physically often don't have the time to do, and to have these conversations. And we're going to continue to do more of this in the future, not less, and to use these technologies to tie us together and to make the whole of this network stronger.
Well, I know we could keep going for quite a while, so I want to move to our closing comments. I'll ask Perrin and Trevin for some closing comments, and then turn it over to Jessica to close the meeting. But I will say this, thank you to Chuck for partnering with us again. Thank you, Perrin and Trevin, for the tremendous work that you're doing. I've been involved with the Chamber movement since the 1990s. And Jessica's comments about this may be the Canadian Chamber's finest hour, I think is spot on. I mean, the leadership that you've shown through this crisis, I know you've been working 24/7, and we'll get through this. And a big part of why we'll get through this is because of your leadership, your insight, and the advice that you're giving to government, and your receptiveness to hearing the voice of all corners of this country, the small businesses, the large international companies, and everyone in between. So as a proud Canadian Chamber member, thank you very much for all that you do. And I'll turn it over to Perrin and Trevin, and then ask Jessica to conclude.
Well, Lauren, let me simply reciprocate and say how grateful we are at the Canadian Chamber level to our chamber network across the country and the businesses that continue to support them. I've never been more proud of this network, and I've never been more grateful for the support that we've had from you and our colleagues across the country. As I guess we've conveyed, these are tough times. We don't have to tell anybody that. And they're going to continue to be tough times for some while yet. But the one thing that we do know is that we're stronger together. And one thing that we are determined about at the federal level, at the Canadian Chamber level, is that we will be there to assist in any way that we can. You, through your strength in representing Main Street Canada, give us our strength. And anything we can do to backstop you and help you, we'll be there. So thank you to everybody who's been on the call, and thank you in particular for your collaboration, which is just tremendous. We're very proud to be partners.
Thank you. Trevin?
I mean, I would just echo what Perrin said as well, is that, you know, it's first of all an honor to receive invitations like this, to talk to chambers of commerce, local and provincial, but also, you know, businesses and hearing from them on the ground and the questions that they have and doing whatever we can to help. It really reminds us at the Canadian Chamber who we're doing this for, and you know, what type of impact we can have, you know, for individual businesses and individual Canadians. And so, you know, Perrin's right, it's going to continue to be tough. And we are there to do whatever we can to help businesses, to advocate on their behalf. And so if there is any way that we can serve you better in terms of policy ideas, in terms of programming ideas, in terms of the Canadian Business Resilience Network, please don't hesitate to reach out to us or your local and provincial chambers of commerce.
Thank you, Trevin. And again, that's www.cbrn.ca. Again, all the survey information is there. It's your one-stop shop for information on federal programming, all that the Chamber Network's doing. So please make sure you check it out. Final word to our chair, Jessica Dumas.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this conversation between the three levels of the Chamber movement, working closely together and supporting our business and our economy. And I love to hear we are stronger together. I truly believe that. This was very insightful, and I'm sure our members and our listeners also feel the same way. Thank you very much to the Winnipeg Chamber team, to the Manitoba Chamber team, and to Perrin Beatty, as well as Trevin Stratton. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to everyone else who joined us. Please remember to check out our website at winnipeg-chamber.com for COVID-19 business support links, as well as a recently uploaded video channel of some of our online conversations and also more ways to connect. So thank you to each of you, and please enjoy the rest of your day.